Dankjewel. You okay? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. A very warm welcome to all of you. We will be doing this in English because one of our speakers doesn't master our beautiful language, but we're happy to be able to do this in English. We're here to celebrate the actual existence of a project that is funded by the European Commission, a project that involves several universities, University of Malta, University of Groningen in the Netherlands, University of Pisa, and the Slovene Writers Association. This is the end for, I will be introducing the speakers in a moment, but the end for the two of us of a very long day, but we are still very energetic and we're going to give all that we have. We will be talking about the essay, that's the topic of the project. Mario Aquilina, Professor Aquilina, will briefly introduce the project in a second. I'll first start by saying something about the structure that we are more or less will want to follow. It's a very rough structure, we will see what happens. When you're talking about the essay, it's of course, you cannot have a fixed structure, so you need a sort of an openness. We will talk about the essay as journey, the essay as a meeting ground between readers and writers, between writers and their tradition. We will talk about the essay as a force field, the relationship of the essay to social change, societal problems. So that's more or less the structure. The idea is to end around 9 o'clock, then to give you some time to ask questions if you like. If you want to do that in Dutch, no problem, we will translate. If you want to do it in another language, we will hopefully find someone to be able to translate. Let me introduce the speakers first in alphabetical order. Professor Mario Aquilina is a professor of English at the University of Malta, where he teaches and where he does research on the essay. The book covers that you can see on the slide are two books that he worked on, that he edited and for which he wrote chapters. So he's let's say, a specialist of the tradition of the essay. Mario is also the academic lead of the project. He's the one who started off the project. Second speaker to my left, Dutch novelist living in Brussels, Persis Bekkering, the author of two novels that were, I think I can safely say, well received by both broad readership and literary critics, in Heldenleven and Access. Persis also writes essays, contributes to both, let's say, paper publications and internet publications. And our third speaker, Stefan Hertmans, the author of, I'm not going to name all the titles, so briefly, the reason why we invited him is to some extent the book that you can see on the slide to your left, or the books, I should say, collected a volume of Stefan's essays, collection of essay collections from the middle of the 1980s up to 2022. So let's say 4 decades at least of essay writing. Stefan is also the author of prize-winning poetry collections and novels. The most famous titles, I think, are Oorlog en Terpentijn, which some of you will have read, The Bekeerlinge. And there's as you can see on the slide, there's a forthcoming novel that many people are already excited about, wanting to read, that will be presented on the 5th of October in Brussels, so very soon. Before I start asking questions, I'm going to ask Mario maybe to briefly introduce the project to you so that you get an idea of what it is that we are trying to accomplish in the course of the 2 years, and then we'll start the Q&A session.
Thanks, Jürgen. So Essays Beyond Border, as Jürgen has explained quite well, is a collaboration between 5 different universities and the Slovene Writers Association. And it's a 3-year project, not 2, so you have to work a little bit more than that. And it runs till the end of 2026. It's funded by Erasmus Plus, and you could say it has 3 main pillars. The first one is that we are offering in the different countries a significant number of essay writing workshops. So essentially, we're bringing post-secondary students, we're bringing university students, but we're also bringing members of the general public, including established writers in different countries, 2 different workshops where the focus is on essayistic writing with a particular focus on place. So there's a significant number of those, and we're not only running the workshops but also researching around them. So that's one pillar. The second one is a research branch. So we're focusing on the concept of the planetary essay. So we're asking ourselves, what is the essay in the time of the planetary, and therefore related to issues of place, of climate change, and we're trying to see whether the planetary essay exists and how it could be theorized, and we're working together towards writing about this particular topic. And the third pillar is an Easter school, which will be organizing in Pisa in April 2026. It's going to be a 4-day event, so a lot of the work will culminate there. It will bring together scholars of the essay, students of the essay, essayists, and it's already attracting interest from beyond Europe, in fact, because essay conferences are not that common, and therefore they bring in people from all around the world. So that's the third pillar. But you know, as the work on the project has begun, this will inevitably lead to more things which we did not expect, right? So it's allowing all of us to get to know new people and to enter into different conversations. The theme of the project, Essays Beyond Borders, explores, of course, the planetary idea, but also the ways in which the essay can be a vehicle for public discourse, right? So there is this dimension which I'm sure we'll be exploring between the private and the public, and that is, I think, one of the main issues that we're looking at. How does the essay work as this bridge in some way between the individual and the public, let's say. So I think that gives a decent summary of what we're doing, Jürgen.
Okay, thanks. First topic, let's say first metaphor is the essay as journey. One of the things that I wanted to talk, especially with Stefan and Persis about, but Mario can always, dig in when you feel the need to, is since you are both writers of essays on the one hand, but also other literary genres on the other, novels, in the case of Stefan also poems, theater texts. The inevitable question is what's the difference, not for readers, but for you as a writer, between a novel and an essay? Is it and how do your essays relate to your other works? I recall that in the introduction to the edited collection of essays, the editor, Johan Reniers, writes that Stefan's essays would not be possible without the other literary work and the other way around. And that, let's say, that quotation in itself begs the question, but what is exactly that relationship, and how, as a writer of text, do you see that relationship? We'll come to you with the same question, but I'll start with Stefan.
To me, in the beginning of, let's say, the act of writing, in the beginning, I do not know which genre it will become. Of course, mostly I know it's not going to become a poem. I know when a poem is coming on. I can hear the music, I can see the thought or the image or something. But it might as well be that in reading a book, there's a thought that I later work out more as an essay or more as a poem or more as a story. So initially, there is only the text, there's what you're reading, and the fact that reading gives you some sort of incentive. I must say that in practically all my books, the last pages are just scribbled, that they're full of notes, things I think about, and in the most various ways, not always structured on what I'm reading, but taking a jump from the text that I'm reading to something that fits in what I'm doing at that moment. So initially, for me, this is very important to know that the so-called inspiration, a word I mistrust a bit, because that's something vague that I do not like, but that the associations, associative thinking that starts from reading a text, initially to me, does not fit in something that is clearly to become an argument, for instance. It becomes an argument because I start writing on it. And I think that every writer knows that you can think as much as you want about something. It might be in your life, about people, about politics, about anything. But the moment you start writing about it, you think differently. And then you see that, in fact, you think something else about it than what you thought when you were not writing. That's magic. And that, to me, is, of course, already a first definition of the essay, is that you try your pen and that you try to know what you're thinking in this way. So there's always this tension, this dark aspect which lures you, which seduces you into the writing. And then for me, the almost the euphoric energy is that you feel it's coming. I can feel that there's more into it. I do not dig, but I run to a certain argument. And I think we should in these days make it a strict and a very clear distinction between what we call non-fiction and an essay. An essay is not non-fiction. Somebody writing non-fiction knows what he's going to tell you. Somebody who's a real essayist is trying to think for himself what he thinks about something. That's because it's, and then you can go back to the great theorists of the essays. The essay is a way of thinking. It's an action in language, and that's different from writing a book on a topic which you already know. So we're talking now about the philosophical and the literary essay, and not about the non-fiction.
Persis? Similar idea. I saw you nodding all the time.
Yes. I'm very much in line with what Stefan said, even though my practice looks a little bit different. I think my approach as a novelist is quite essayistic. It always starts with big questions, things I just need to understand, things I want to do research on. And then I do a lot of research. And along the way, I produce essays, but that's usually by invitation or commissioned writing. I haven't yet published an essay collection with essays that just spontaneously sprouted from my research. So I have this big idea for a novel. It's like this horizon, which is like a site in which I can explore questions on, often around art, history, but then I become so knowledgeable about a specific topic that I develop my own original ideas, and then someone asks me, what are you working on, or can you write something for us? And I can share these things along the way. And then the novel itself, which starts with these questions, usually changes so much that it often diverges from what I set out to do. So it's when the novel writing starts, I have characters that start to, I don't want to mystify it, but they start to move on their own, and they have their own desires and wishes that I do not yet oversee when I start writing it. This is maybe also something you will recognize. And then the novel becomes something entirely different from this initial fantasy that I had. But then, so it's like a journey. I've produced these essays and a novel which are not really coming together. But then again, I also think that my fiction writing does have some essayistic elements to it, especially the last one, Excess. The last, it's a novel in 5 parts, which I imagined as episodes that are kind of equal in weight or intensity. There's not one climax or most important episode. And the last one is in fact quite essayistic, which led to some complaints of critics that said, well, what in the end, it was a nice novel, but in the end it just becomes an essay. So as if that's not, that's also an interesting question maybe for our discussion. Like when a novel does take an essayistic turn, does it stop being a novel? Does it stop being a good novel? Is it betraying its form, or can a novel also encompass that?
There are novels who contain essays.
Absolutely,
essays
yeah. I didn't really understand this criticism or this complaint, but
yeah, Musil is a
Musil,
perfect example. Sebald is a
absolutely.
On the other hand, I must say, when I was writing Dios, my newest novel, which is about friendship and the contrast between friendship and passion, love. And I was asked by somebody in a publishing house, would you like to write in our series a book about friendship? And I said, I do not want to write it because I'm going to spoil my novel. I did not want to know explicitly what I'm thinking about friendship because I wanted to go with my characters. And I was so moved by the friendship between the two men in my book. And I thought, I do not want to think theoretically about it. I want to think intuitively. Now the book is written, I could do this. But if I would write an essay while writing my book, the only thing would be, for instance, to have essayistic passages, which it has, but where is friendship different from love, for instance? But an essay could spoil also what you want to write, because the implicit writing you need for a novel is another way of thinking.
Yeah, I wanted to come back related to that, to what you said about the essay. You say, okay, it's not non-fiction, but would you go so far as saying that then that means that the essay is fiction? Probably not. It's not non-fiction?
No, in the first place, I think it's a horrible word. Do you call your car a non-bicycle? I mean, where does this come from? Non-fiction. It's a horrible expression. So I loathe it. I hate it.
It probably comes from publishers who know that fiction doesn't sell well.
But on the other hand, of course, a good essay, a good literary essay, has fiction in it. I mean, fiction fingeren means to make something up. And the good thing about a real literary essay is that it's so whimsical, that it plunges you into one thing and it jumps to another book. For me, the most marvelous essayist is Borges, of course. In reading Borges, you jump from one side of the room to another. You think, what was it about? I was in a whoosh of thoughts. And it's hard to put your finger on what the hard argument is, but you feel like something opened in your mind, some sort of associative power. So this is the magic of putting things together. And I think it's Walter Benjamin who as the first used the word constellation. It's a constellation. You put things together. I call it, with the term of one of my earliest books, a solidified cloud, a coagulated cloud, a cloud that takes on a form. But it was like a cloud, and you made a form out of it. I tended, as I say in the beginning of my collected essays, I tended to put all the books I had read for a certain essay, I put them together on the bookshelf. I couldn't split them up again because they had become family, because I put them together. And they were only together because I had found a link that was not there before. The good essay makes a link between things that in fact are not linked.
But it doesn't mean that it's not without form, right? Because I teach also in a creative writing department, and my students often think that the essay just means anything goes, right? And I don't think that's the case. Yes, you can jump from left to right. You can bring together very disparate subjects, but it doesn't mean that it's formless.
No, of course. No, that's very important. I think even Adorno says something after he has said that the essay is something completely unsystematical or anti-systematical, etc. But just don't do this. You have to have studies behind your back before you can do this.
Internal logic.
It's like ice skating. you can do anything you want if you know how to do it. So of course you need some knowledge before you can play with it.
Mario, could you say something more about the essay not being fiction, not being non-fiction, but not being fiction at the same time?
I'm glad you mentioned Borges, who's one of my favorite writers, and I've got the Penguin collected works, and he's got the poems, 3 books, and the fictions and the non-fictions, and there are essays in both, I would argue. Coincidentally, this morning, in discussions that we had, someone in the discussion said, you can't think of Borges' work as essays because it's fictional. And I wanted to ask you a question, therefore, because a lot of the definitions and the ideas that you've been working with so far in this discussion of what the essay is form-oriented, right, or process-oriented. So you're describing the essay as a collection, as a constellation, as a form of finding affinities, as a process of discovery. And one of the words we were talking earlier on about the different traditions of the essay, one of the words that has so far not been mentioned is the idea of voice, of the essayist's voice. And I think that links with Jürgen's questions about the non-fictional element, because of course, in a public context where the essay makes a public intervention, it is often in the voice of a person who assumes personal responsibility for what they want to say. So what are your views on that? I mean, how important is this contractual relationship, if you will, that the essayist establishes with the reader in signing this as their work, right? So you're talking of critics who are referring to parts of your novel as descending into the essayistic, almost like a kind of critique of that. But isn't there in the essayistic also a different kind of signature that you put to your work than when you sign that work as a novelist?
Yeah.
Would you say that there is that difference?
Yeah, theoretically speaking, we would say in courses that we teach students that it's maybe not a difference between fiction and non-fiction, but it's a difference in the sense that the person speaking in the essay is the writer, the person speaking in the novel is the narrator. And so in a novel, you don't speak in your own name, you speak in somebody. And does that mean that that's, for readers, that may be significant, but the question is it also significant for authors? Do you have the feeling that when you write an essay, I am speaking as Persis Bekkering, as Stefan Hertmans, but my novel has a narrator that is not me?
But it doesn't mean that a narrator cannot write essays.
Sure.
In the new book I'm writing, which should be finished very soon, the book is drenched in online culture and online forms of speaking and expression and writing, and there are a lot of characters, and a lot of them are actually writing essays. So I'm experimenting with the fictional voice, or the fictional essay writer, actually, which is very interesting in this regard. But I do agree that the essay is very much tied to voice, whereas in the academic text, for example, you're supposed to efface that in favor of a more sort of
Unfortunately,
universal or abstract voice. And it's, as a reader of essays, that's maybe that's one of the most important things. I read essays because I feel drawn by a voice, it's like the siren call. It's voice. I want to spend time with this voice. That's why I find myself returning to specific essayists again and again.
But it's also like you said, when you write a novel, your characters can take over, but when you write an essay, there are no characters to take something over. I mean, it continues to be you who is, or is that?
To me, it's a very complex question. It's the question of the signature, who signs in you. And then there's this wonderful small essay, you know, Borges and I.
Yeah.
It's the most wonderful page of prose he has written, in which he says, who is writing? Is it I or is it Borges? And who is the Borges who writes my books? And who am I who writes this? It's a wonderful small essay, and it's a story. It's a short story as well. And it's about this, who in you signs the book, because you are intersectional. You are different persons. So I understand your question as asking me, is it the same person who signs for the essay or the person assigns for the novel. Because, of course, in a novel as well, it might be me talking. If I write an autobiographical novel, it's a me, which is not exactly the author, as we know, but can resemble him. The essay is far more direct. It's me personally speaking. That's certainly true. The playground is different, and it's smaller because you, of course, in an essay you want to be authentic. You want to be taken serious. You're talking about something, and you're not just saying anything. In a novel, I can, to say it in beautiful Flemish, ik kan met je voeten spelen. I can turn you around. I can lure you into some plots. I can do different things, which in an essay, of course, I don't. I'm more serious. And even in essay writing during the years, when I look at my first essays, I was very playful, very whimsical even in some essays. I started with Walter Benjamin and ended with David Bowie and so on. By teaching for decades, I felt that some of my essays, in fact, I was writing for my students. Or I wrote them because I had been talking for weeks about a certain topic with my students. And which sometimes happened to me, that in the midst of a course, I said, I'm sorry, I was talking about something I was sure of for 20 years. And in telling it now, I discover something that doesn't fit. It's not true. Let's drink coffee and start all over again. So then my teaching became essay writing orally. And then afterwards I could go home and write for hours. And some of my essays have been written for my students. And I ask myself, because I've never considered them in that way myself, but whether you can see this, that some of them were written with a more didactic intention.
In the earlier phase of your career.
Yes, and others just for myself, because I had the pleasure of writing about something that your pen starts running and it can't stop. That's entirely different, and it's twice an essay.
Yeah.
It also reminds me of Seneca's epistolary letters to Lucilius, right? Which become almost didactic but also essayistic. So I wanted to perhaps ask you both, if I could ask a question about this possibly being a difference from the novel, therefore, a kind of conversational relation with a reader that in the essay is always there, right? So that it is a conversation. It could be a lesson, but it could be a conversation. And probably that dynamic in your writing with a novel is something different, right? I don't think, you'll tell me, of course, that a novelist thinks of a novel as primarily a conversation, right? With perspective. So whether this idea makes any sense to you in terms of trying to outline differences between the two forms.
Differences in readership also.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I really love what you just said about the essays you wrote for your students, and I can totally imagine. I mean, I've only been teaching for 3 years now. I'm very beginner, but I have already had the privilege of experiencing moments where I realized, wow, I think today I learned more from them than they probably learned from me, and that's the magic of teaching, and it's so important for a writer actually to teach. Is what I'm discovering. But I do think that the essay has a different conversation with of course, a novel is also a conversation with the reader. Otherwise, there's no point in writing anything. But I imagine a novel to be much more of a closed world in its own, that as a reader you enter into on its own terms. And an essay, for me, is a much more open form. And in all these openings, it is a more direct invitation for a reader to do something with that. I'm not sure how to answer that. I mean, I think I learned a lot as a reader from reading essays, and then, but also then if it was an essay I was particularly into, I would also like reverse engineer, like read all the quotes, all the books that are quoted in the essay, or like explore all the words I didn't know. And so I learned a lot from, I felt my curiosity was very much incited by reading essays. And that also ties to your question about something I wanted to add is that I think particularly in contemporary essayism, probably also more historical, but like if you think about like popular essayists today, we discussed this over dinner, like Maggie Nelson. My students are also reading Maggie Nelson. Her essay book Bluets is not only her having a voice speaking, but actually sharing the space with a lot of other authors. It's full of block quotations, so including a lot of other voices to share that space. I think in a novel you don't do that so much as in an essay. You can do that.
Yeah. One thing when you were saying about when you said it in Flemish, as a novelist, you can met de voeten spelen. You can play with your reader, and you can, invent all sorts of things and drive people in a specific direction. You want to, in narratology, we call this the unreliable narrator. We would never say the unreliable essayist. That's a concept that doesn't make any sense. The essayist always has to be reliable to a certain extent.
Although Borges comes
yeah.
close to the unreliable essayist.
Yeah.
That's the magic even, but he's unique, of course.
Yeah.
Let's put him aside.
But you wanted to contradict what I
No, I
was
mean
saying.
they're also like they're like the unreliable journalists, right? The unreliable journalistic essays with a lot of fiction. And you're like, this scene is just too good to be true.
Yeah, but in literature, of course, it's a technique that you are unreliable because there's what they call the dramatic irony.
Yeah.
You're writing something with a wink of the eye to the good reader, who knows that in fact something else will happen than what you're saying. That's very much fun in writing a novel. You can have a lot of irony in an essay, I guess, but that's a different mood. You can have different, and of course we're talking about a planet. I was thinking this morning, what are we going to talk about in the essay? Am I going to talk about Paul Auster's essays, which are almost like stories, autobiographical stories? Are we going to talk about Joan Didion, about William Butler Yeats' essays, about Brodsky? With each name I name, you have another planet of essay writing. And so we're talking about a huge thing. So this is not only a genre, there are so many genres in the essay itself.
That's why we have 3 years. So
And then, sorry, to include one more thing, I think a lot of good essays have actually started as lectures or teachings. Also, when we think of the planetary essay, the first thing that comes to mind for me is Amitav Ghosh, The Great Derangement, that started as a series of lectures, became a very interesting essay book. So in that sense, the conversation is often there from the moment of spawning.
One example of the unreliability of whether it's possible for an essayist to be unreliable. I'm thinking of Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal, in which you have a clear difference between the essayist. I'm committing myself to calling that one an essay, right? What is it? I can think of it as an essay. And the narrator, who's, of course, being used in an ironic way, right? So that you have a distinction between the persona and the writer, let's call him writer here, who has a clear position about the world, right? He's talking about the oppression of the Irish. And we know where Swift is, and that's a different position to that taken by the persona. And to different degrees, you can find this in many essayists. So, of course, Montaigne speaks about sincerity and how his book is himself, he is the book, but then he also warns us that his memory is very fallible, and that he will only tell us what he dares to tell us, and what he tells us today might be different from what he tells us next time, because he's changeable. So I guess that distinction is not so clear, right? So despite the fact that we mentioned the signature, one signs in one's own name, there's also always a persona in the writing that is not us, right? So the Borges idea also applies here, I guess.
Persis, you mentioned the openness of the essay. I teach a course on essay writing, and one of the problems, students have many problems in order to do it, but one of the problems they have is, how do you stop? Not so much how do you begin, but when do you stop? Because the idea is that it's a text that is open-ended. It could stop anywhere. You could say, okay, I stop because the essay has been commissioned and I have 6,000 words, so I need to stop. How do you finish an essay? It's also a question for you. You're looking at her, but you can also answer it, Stefan.
I just wanted to give Persis the first floor, so to speak.
I always struggle with endings. Usually the solution is to cut the last couple hundred words, and then actually it's much better. This desire to really bring something to a close is exactly not what makes an essay interesting. But at the same time, especially earlier, like when I was less experienced, I think I saw the essay as just an exploration, a mood. But then that would mean that, yeah, you can basically end anywhere, because it's more, once you have the voice, once you have the mood, and you're exploring a topic, it's not about. But then again, I do want to defend form, that it does have to end somewhere, and it does have to go somewhere. I think once something is teased out that you didn't even see that was there in the beginning when you started writing it, and you can keep adding until something is teased out that just completely surprises you. I think you have to continue till you're there, that moment.
And is the ending sort of an end of a thought, or is it more like
it's a new path.
Sort of a note or something like in music? You can feel that
it's
the
never
end of the
the
song
end of
is
a thought.
coming.
I mean, the end of thought is
No,
death.
no.
But I think until a new path emerges.
Swerve.
Yeah.
Maybe some kind of swerve or
Right.
turn.
Right. How do you see that, Stefan?
Well, in the first place, I want to think about how do I begin writing an essay. Very many essays will tell you, because it starts out from reading. An essay starts in medias res. Writing an essay about Kafka is not saying, Mr. Kafka was born in blah, blah, blah. But it's saying, in one of his stories, there is one very weird sentence in which Kafka makes a remark about. That's the essay. It starts, it plunges, it dives into a detail, and out of the detail, it takes out the whole at the end. That's fantastic in essay writing. But when it's finished, I think I can feel the end of an essay coming, so to speak, because I know what I wanted to tell about this topic is now exhausted. The topic is not exhausted, but what I wanted to say about it is exhausted. That's a very interesting difference.
Do you know before you start writing? Do you know where it will?
No, because I don't know what I'm going to write. That's why I write essays, because I want to find out what I think about something. And I think about a word that a Flemish choreographer once said to me. He said, Stefan, it's not difficult to pick up something, but it's so difficult to put it down in a beautiful way. That was a very wise word that hangs above my bed, so to speak. You can pick up anything you want, but put it down in a good way. And to put it down in a good way in an essay is to know, like the painter who must at a certain moment withdraw his brush and say, one brush stroke more and it's done.
Yeah.
I will spoil it. I have to finish now. It's not that this is everything that is to be said about this topic, but it's everything I wanted to say about it. And my essay ends with a sentence where others can hook on and continue, because I'm not writing somewhere autonomous in an isolated space. I'm writing with the other writers. I'm writing in a community, and I have very much that feeling that there is this conversation, and that when I end an essay, somebody else can take up there. So the end of an essay is not the end.
So the final sentence is sort of, this is all I had to say. Now it's up to...
For the moment. I might come back on this in 10 years or something. Yeah.
I have a question about that. So that is what the essay reads on the page. But when you finish writing an essay and then you go back to it, like one goes back to a first draft of a novel, right? And when you're looking at the first draft of a novel, I would imagine that form, the architecture of the piece is very important, and one revises. Is there a difference in the process of revision? Okay, when one is revising a novel and redrafting, and is there something that is lost possibly in revising an essay too much? I was once told that something I had written was much better in first draft than in sixth draft. They told me, could you go back to the first draft? Because every time you try to perfect it, you actually make it a poorer essay. I would guess with a novel there's a different dynamic of revising. Now, a lot of essays have this talent of making the writing seem spontaneous, like improvisation of thinking, but they, like Montaigne, for example, will revise assiduously. And they will change sentences and add things. What about your own process of revision? Do you see any differences in the way that you look back at earlier drafts of a novel and earlier drafts of an essay? Do you work differently?
Certainly. I'm not a big reviser, I have to say. With my novels, I have a few rounds of editing, but it's not this. Most of the writing is really like facing a blank page, which is a very stressful thing, I have to say. But then once it's finished, I will make some changes, but usually not like major changes. But with essays, I can continue revising, and it often comes down to, especially going back to the beginning, by cutting a lot, because I can see the scaffolding, and I think an essay is usually much better when it begins in medias res. I think I often spend way too many paragraphs justifying why I want to talk about this, and then whenever you read it, I'm like, no, I'm just talking about this. I can do away with these scaffoldings and just plunge the reader in it. And I think through revising, I feel more courage to leave openings, to leave white spaces for thought. In a novel, it's I think I use all this like build up more in a novelistic way.
My problem is in reworking an essay that there's a fight in me between the writer, the poet, and the didactic one. And very often I've spoiled an essay completely by adding things, I think. But hasn't Kant in the third critique said something very interesting that I can insert? Blah, de blah. I insert it. And wasn't there one of those aphoristic things of Ernst Bloch that was very interesting about women when I talk about Flaubert, and I spoil my essay completely. And then afterwards I have to return to my first draft and say, oh, but that was beautiful, because I was speaking for myself. So there is, of course, this seduction, the lure of the one in you who is enthusiastic. And because you're enthusiastic, you want to add a lot. That's why, for instance, critics will say he is what they called me once when I was a younger essayist, an omgevallen boekenkast. He's just a bookshelf turned down. As if you do that to be pedant. Of course you don't do that to show off. If you would show off, you wouldn't be writing essays. You could do something else.
Comment.
You can buy a Maserati or something if you want to show
There's
off.
always the threat of this criticism
crazy.
that you're,
As if you do it to show off.
You
do it
that
out of love
too
of
many
bookshelves.
writers and
Yes, it's
your toppled bookshelves.
Exactly, your toppled bookshelf. Now it's that in writing a good essay, you feel that your bookshelves are beginning to glow. And things are saying, I want to be in your essay. I want to be in your essay. And you take them out, and it's very interesting. But the essay is something like good cooking. If you put too many ingredients in it, it will
spoil the dish.
Taste awful. So there is a certain sort of dosage in it, which is also quite some. Adorno calls it the music of your thoughts. There's a certain musicality, not only of the sentences, but the music of your thoughts. You can make a very, you can spoil your melody.
Speaking of revising and Montaigne, what Montaigne did was, after a couple of years, he then looked, and then he didn't so much change in his writing, but he added specific paragraphs. Is that something when, if you had to, let's say, edit your own collected essays, is that something you would have done, or do you think, no, these are texts that were written at a specific moment in a specific time, and they reflect what I was thinking at that time, and they have to remain that way? Because that is also something about the essay. It has a specific local, historical origin.
Yeah, the latter. I wouldn't add anything anymore. I think I wrote it at, you write something at a certain point in time, and that's obviously later you will have a lot more to say about that. But it's also beautiful to look back in time, and to not try to be too controlling, exactly like your bookshelves will start to glow when you write an essay, but also when you read essays, and it just activates this power of association, and that's one of the most beautiful things about the essay form. And you can never stop, and you keep making these connections and associations, but indeed you have to, as a writer, you have to boil it down, find the right measure, which of course is not an absolute measure that exists in the outside world. It's you who have to find the right measure for it to become a melody. And I do think that if you will reread your old work, of course you will have a lot more associations, but
Sure.
I think then I would respect the historicity of something in time, and maybe you decide to again write something about the same phrase in Kafka, but then 10 years later.
I want to move on to the second metaphor, the essay as meeting ground, related to what you were saying about the bookshelf. Of course, you don't name drop to show off, but you have these references. It's a question, because you want to belong to a certain tradition, because you want to belong to a certain tradition. Let me keep it at that. That's also one of the topics in the project itself. Also, the idea of there possibly being a European tradition, and the question of what that tradition then is. That is less tied also to, let's say, in some aspects of literary history, there's a lot of stress on the national literary history, in the sense that as a novelist, you are in a Flemish or in a Dutch novelistic tradition, which is something with respect to the essay we don't say that much. With the essay, there seems to be a more of a sort of an international tradition.
Definitely. Writing essays is what the word of a great Dutch writer, Vogelaar, is writing back to someone. It's writing a letter back to the one of whom you've read a book. So you're constantly in that community, in that eucomene of writers. And if you look at the great essay writers in our language, and certainly in not only in Dutch but also in Flemish, you can see that they have always been international. They've always been influenced by international models. There might be something like a Flemish novel, but I doubt whether there is something like a Flemish essay. I don't think so. If you look at Van Hofstein's essays, it was radically international already, and that's why it was so new. And I can't imagine an interesting nationalism in essay writing. It's horrible to think about that.
Yes, I agree, but then I do think you can speak of a difference in American, US essay writing versus European essay writing. In the US, you have this genre, the memoir, which is almost untranslatable into Dutch. Mémoire, that's a very different form than the memoir. I think, especially at the moment, the production of personal essays in the US is huge. And we already, in a pre-discussion to tonight, we both agreed that there's the Dutch from the Netherlands, Dutch writers are very much oriented towards American writing, contemporary writing, whereas the Flemish are much more, I guess, oriented or influenced by French tradition, which produces a divide. The American essay is often today even produced within the academic sphere, in conferences, especially more in the not so much in philosophy, but in literary studies. I noticed that a lot of contributions are very much personal essay style.
I think in an American context, the essay was fundamental for the formation of an American identity. So within that context, I would say, and that I would agree with you, that in many other contexts, there isn't that obsession with the national tradition within the essay. But within an American context, especially in the 19th century with Thoreau, for example, the essay is really crucial for the formation of the idea of America. And I think that continues with the early 1930s and 40s in the protest essays of what it means to be American with a different skin color, for example. And within that context, I would say it's very difficult to divide or to separate issues of national identity from the essay. But it's also in essay studies and in theories of the essay, right? And in which traditions you align yourself with. If you've been trained with Roland Barthes and Jacques Derrida and to a certain extent Adorno and Lukács, who are theorists that some American theorists of the essay never mention, you're going to come up with different ideas of what the essay is. That if you're brought up thinking of the personal or the protest essay in an American context, I would say.
Is it also true that the American writers do not know the system we know in Europe, that you can be subsidized or that you can easily find work for working for a journal or for something else? That very many of them, certainly American poets, work for work in universities.
Yes.
And that means that the academic essay in American literature is, to my opinion, I can be wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, but is more literary and is more like a memoir and is more free in style, while we in Europe tend to more isolate the essay as a real genre. And I think that American intellectuals, who so often have to be linked to university to earn their living, have developed some other accents.
Mm-hmm.
If you look, for instance, the essays of Auster have been collected. To me, they are stories. But in the stories, he develops thoughts. So it becomes really an essay. But he starts in a completely different way from we in Europe. Because, of course, we've been intimidated by Adorno, by Walter Benjamin, and so on, which were very intimidating examples of what is the criterion for a good essay. It's theorizing in a free way or something, the Freigeist, the free intellectual. It's speculative what I'm saying, but I think it would be interesting to look into that.
I share this analysis. I think it's very much correct. Also, the function of academic jobs for poets and writers in the U.S. It's not it's not the same here in Europe, and I do think that in the U.S. the academic essay is spilling over into literature very much.
There are also the institutional differences of how universities work. Apart from people having jobs in universities, there are also courses in creative writing which specialize in a particular brand of essays, which is, I think, quite different from the way.
And also because the let's say the book market is, of course, in the linguistic market is much larger. So the idea that you can make a living simply by writing it's not evident for everybody, but it makes more sense that you can do that if you reach a big enough market. And you would see that the people who reach the biggest markets don't need jobs in universities. They can. I wanted to come back to tradition for you, Stefan, because at the beginning, the essays that you mentioned that you wrote for your students with didactic purposes, was there also the idea that I want to belong to that, I want to be affiliated with that group of authors, I want to belong to that tradition, or this is the way I want to write? And if so, how would you describe that tradition? What brings these people? Because you can, of course, you can refer to any book that's in your bookshelf, but you refer to specific books. And what brings these references together?
Now, of course, very often the incentives at stake are differentiated. I mean, in a certain way, you want to belong to the literary community of your country. You want to take part in the discussion. A writer is also a citizen who writes. So as a citizen, politically, you can be worried about what's happening in your country. And you can do that in an essayistic way as well. So you're as well a citizen speaking out on political issues. So there are very many different things. The answer to this is complex. There's always much more at stake. And I couldn't write a purely didactic essay. And I couldn't write purely an essay for myself, because then you can write it down in your journals for yourself, your diaries. But taking part in and I think this is what you're aiming at what are you taking part? And there is this community of people that you think about Michael Rifater in the 70s said, you have an ideal reader in your mind when you write. There's somebody in your mind who always understands you. If you make a small joke, he will know. If you're ironical, he or she will see. If you have an understatement, a wink of an eye to another book, he will or she will understand. This, of course, is not true, but it drives you forth to make clear your own ideas in the light of a community. And this community, in all of our heads, it would be interesting to talk about this. Who do you have in mind when you write an essay? And I think for very many people, this is or vague or multiple. It's vague. I think you have to keep it quite vague if you want to really write a beautiful essay in style. But if you are directed toward your political commitment, you take part in a discussion with people who have the same opinions as you have, or you address it to people you think are a danger to democracy, or anything. So there are so many answers to this question that very often I think there are many of those aspects at stake at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And that composes, that makes the symphony, the small symphony that a good essay is.
And am I correct in thinking that in the case of the development of your essays, that the shift towards those political questions become more important as time progresses, in the sense that in the earlier phase, it's more about artistic issues, poetical issues, more affiliation with writers of literature, than in the later. And I'll ask the question to Persis the other way around, possibly, but because with you it's probably more immediately political, and then the question is, how is it going to develop? No.
Okay.
Is the impression right that there is a sort of a...
There was a shift in my essay writing. In the beginning, I was, of course, when you start writing and you're in your 20s, you're romantic. Whether you want it or not, you're romantic. And so I wanted to find out about myself, about what I was interested in. And my essays were very poetic. I think it was Simon Westlake who once wrote that every writer, when he's young, has a poetic soul. In his 30s until his 50s, he has an epic soul. And in the third stage, where I'm in now, Westlake says you have a dramatic soul. You see dramatic things. So he has a dramatic one now speaking. I don't know whether it's correct, but I recognize the fact that my first period of essays were more poetic. And then I became epic, so to speak. You want to take part in the great story of your country and your society and your time and the literature of your time, international, whatever. And I feel that I got more concerned. I have been, for instance, one of my latest essays is Verschuivingen, which is something like what is shoving away underneath our feet in democracy, what is changing fast, gliding or whatever. That I'm almost outspoken. I follow Bruno Latour and so on, just wanting to think aloud and on paper about what is happening to us and to democracy and to the planet, to climate change. So I see in myself that I got more worried and more angry in getting older. I think it's good to become an angry old man.
Are you in your epic phase already? Or is it that, of course, the times may be changing as well, in the sense that I can imagine I have the same feeling, even though I'm slightly younger.
Yes, it's a good question. I was thinking while you were speaking about where these essays today can find an outlet, because I think for the Dutch language, it's becoming more and more difficult to even be the poetic essayist, or to publish that at least, apart from publish it in a book. Like the kind of the media that would want such texts are becoming more and more sparse. I think what I started. I think I'm not sure if I can already like see this kind of development in my work, but I do see that in the last couple of years, what has been obsessing me a lot is to connect. I think I mostly write essays about literature, But what I can see is that I keep connecting literary form to an idea of the political. So I think I keep reading literary form as an expression of something, and I'm looking for those books that that try to reinvent form and do not copy wholesale a classical notion of plot structure, for example, because for me it's not wrong necessarily, but I think the classic narrative is is putting forth an idea of society that is often hidden or concealed, and I think that
Sort of a status quo idea.
exactly, and at the same time, I wonder, is that still accurate to get close to the experience of today, which is for me also in my novelistic work. I think what I keep trying to do is to express what it means to live in a world in crisis. So this feeling, this affect of crisis is very important, and that does come with a different idea of how to build a story, or what even is a story, if maybe the story is also in crisis. So I think that's what I keep circling around in my essays is a curiosity for and sometimes a bit of a critique or like an irritation with with writing that is too easily relying on still forms, maybe. I don't know if that's an answer to your question.
Yeah, it is.
I have a question for you both. So earlier on we began with the essay as a form of thinking, but a lot of the adjectives that you've been using are related to feeling, right? We've spoken about anger, we spoke about passion and the sense of crisis. And I believe that possibly there's not just a different way of thinking, but a different way of feeling when one writes an essay. To me, if philosophy is the preparation for how to die, then the essay suggests a certain hope that even in anger, one still sees in the world around them. I don't know whether you see this, whether you could identify the feelings that propel you to go for the essay as opposed to go for the poem, right? Or to go for the novel, whether there is then not just the process of thinking, cold thinking, but a different attitude which finds its vehicle more appropriately in the essayistic, whether that could be hope or whether the possibility of thinking about a different future, or whether really that's not an argument that you would run with.
I think to me, certainly what is an incentive is you're reading something. You're reading your newspapers in the morning or something, and you see an article again about something that you have been fascinated by, or that worries you. And you think things, and you're drinking your coffee, and you're having breakfast, and you're doing your morning prayer, as Hegel says. And all of a sudden, something strikes you, and you think, I think nobody has written about this. This is maybe one aspect of the 1,000 things that you can see in this subject that I think now I have found, which is of course very arrogant. But if you don't have that feeling or that belief that maybe you found now a small aspect, another opening into the big castle of that topic, that you say, this is a small door nobody has opened. I'm going to open it and see where I come. And maybe you come on the corridor where everybody is, but it's interesting to open it. And that's a good incentive to think, or you hear something on the radio. It can be something that strikes you in the underground, wherever. You think, this is maybe a thought I should note. And very often, this is why essay writers always have notebooks. These days, my notebook is in my iPhone. But you always have notebooks, and you note a thought, you take it down, and if you don't take it down, it's lost. You will not find it back 2 hours later. It's that moment, it's what Walter Benjamin says so nice, die Ähnlichkeit huscht vorbei. There is some similarity in your mind, and it rushes by. And if you don't take it, it's gone. And this is a very beautiful incentive that if you come home and you work on it, it might become an essay. And that for me is the most magical way of doing this. It doesn't always happen like this, but...
Yeah, I think feeling and thinking are are not separate at all. It's definitely starts with a feeling, can be excitement or disconcernment or anxiety. Usually, it's excitement about something. For me, it's also always starting with something I read, or and it resonates. And then the thinking is trying to articulate that. Is trying to get there, what that is, what it is composed of, and I like this notion of Raymond Williams, the structure of feeling, right? Which is it's something you can find in novels or in essay writing or in films, but it's pointing to some condition of what constitutes the condition of a historical moment. But to get there, you need rational analysis. But it starts with something you feel, you carry with.
Yeah, and interestingly, with Williams, it's a structural feeling in the sense it's never individual, in the sense that others in your community will share it with you. So it's not hyper-individual. It's a sort of a collective. Collective thing, which is what the essay tries to do. One of the things we've been discussing today related to the tradition and the essay as a meeting ground are questions having to do with, as Mario explained, there's also a pedagogical angle to the project, in the sense that we want to try and see whether the essay as a genre has anything to say to young people or young students or young readers or young non-readers even. And the question then often is whether the presence of a tradition is not often a sort of an impediment to these readers, where they will think, okay, I'm starting to read this essay by this famous novelist, and then in the second sentence there's a reference to Hegel, in the fourth one there's a reference to Lacan, and then there's another name that I've never heard of. I'll stop reading. So the tradition for some essayists as a sort of a necessity to belong to a community can be sort of a repellent to specific readers in a culture where we say fewer and fewer people know these references. How can we use the essay as a... do you think that is a valid statement? And if not, how can we use the essay as a sort of a pedagogical instrument for
it's
today
an
in a
invitation
time...
to further reading. Anyhow, an essay is an invitation to further reading. And if you're somebody who is repelled by the footnotes, then maybe you're not a real reader. And there's nothing wrong with not being a real reader. Maybe you're a real swimmer. I don't care. But if you're a real reader, you will like the footnotes. You will think it's a paradise to read that something that Shostakovich has said can be found back in another book about blah de blah, and that it all turns around and it's continuous spinning around, and that you find endless corridors in the thinking of man, and that's interesting. That's nice, but it depends on you. And as the proverb says, your character is your fate. It is your character that will define whether you like this or not. You see young people who adore this, and you see young people who say, I hate it. So they have to pick their choice. We're living in a democracy. Not everybody has to like the essay, but there are enough people out there who want. And I think about at a certain moment I was in Switzerland, where I had a sort of residence and a prize. And it's in a small village in Wallis, which is called Loic. Loeche in French. And they have a tradition of literary prizes, etc. And the prize, when you win the prize, is that for a year or two, you can come in residence whenever you like. There's an apartment outside. It's fantastic. So I was there, and then you can go with a lift up to in the mountains to Loic-Abat, which is Loeche-les-Bains, where there's a ski ort. And James Baldwin has been there.
Yeah, right.
In the 50s. In the year I was born, he was there. And he was the first black man that Swiss people saw. And he wrote a fantastic text, essayistic text about this, autobiographical, because they thought it was the devil.
Yeah, stranger in the
When
village.
there was wood disappeared, they said the devil has done it. They were afraid because they had never seen a black man.
Yeah.
And James Baldwin returned and said, I do not share anything with these people. They are from the planet of Bach and Mendelssohn and Beethoven. I'm from the planet of jazz, etc. So I was completely displaced as a person. It's a fantastic text. Now, the young writer, Teju Cole, got back there and wrote an essay on his being there and what the differences were, saying, I'm from New York, I'm black, I'm in Switzerland. Well, they've changed a bit, but not too much, but they're friendly. Okay, I can survive better than Baldwin could at the time. And so I was there as a white man, having read Baldwin and Teju Cole. And I just made a small essay for my own journals, but I thought this is a nice, sort of chain of things that happen. And I used this for my students to say how attractive it is to enter the room of essay writing, because you enter also in a chain of experiences. And if you explain it in a good way, people will always be attracted to it.
Yeah, I think I don't disagree, but I have two things to say about this. And one is that I think this getting discouraged by reading a lot of other names in an essay that you don't know. I think this happens when education becomes something exclusive or for the elite. So I think if it's important to, and I think this is again as a culture here in Europe, it's becoming more and more like equality. The equality is. I think we're losing sight of that. I think as long as education is attainable for everyone, if it's free or affordable, people feel less discouraged by name dropping because they don't feel that world is not for them. So I think it's important if we want to, promote the essay to also promote education for everyone. And the second thing is that I think young generations today actually. You might think that they would be less scared of, like, quotes by authors they don't know. I think about the importance of a social medium like Goodreads, where Goodreads is a platform where you can share the books you're reading and you can share quotes from the books you're reading and people like it or comment on it. And so this model, which is based on a social media platform, it privileges interaction through likes. So if you put a quote by a good quote, you will get a lot of likes and you will be more visible. So it sort of incites the sharing of names, of quotes, but it's never really about the whole book, right? So it becomes more about vibes. And through this Goodreads, I think a lot of people get a sense of they probably have some idea of a Kafkaesque vibe because they just read some quotes here and there. So I think through this use of literature today, the dropping of quotes is just such a normal practice.
Yeah, but I see what you mean. But on the other hand, let's say people who are on Goodreads are readers. And the question is, if you have a class of, 17, 18-year-olds, and I agree about what you say about democracy, but the problem is that the pedagogical system is very rarely a democracy.
Exactly.
In the sense that everybody has to do the same thing in class. And then the question is, what is the best way of approaching or getting these students or these pupils to start to get familiar with essays, with essayistic thinking?
I think there's more pedagogic value with people, with students of that age, with them actually writing essays, of course being exposed to what essays can be, but to give them the possibility to write essayistically. Because let's face it, I mean, the essay has always been a conversation with like-minded people. Montaigne is quoting the classics because that's what his readers will know, right? Hazlitt is actually talking about Lamb, where he knows that Lamb is going to be reading his essays, and it's again a circle of friends. It's very often writing for a circle of like-minded people. Now today's references might be different because we might have lost that tradition that one is expected to have attained through education. So perhaps if you're looking at it pedagogically, what could it do for young people? I would say that rather than as a product for them to consume, I would see it as a process that they can participate in. So there's the democratic possibilities of not only reading about democracy, but actually formulating a voice, and to not simply always repeatedly fall for already given structures of thought, right? So I would say that pedagogically, this is where I see the value for 16, 18-year-olds. I don't know if you would agree with that or not, but I mean, if you go with Hegel and Derrida and Barth with a 16-year-old, there might be some, and you'd be surprised at some of the workshops that I've done. One particular student who's very well read, but that's the exception, of course. So a lot of the associations that we might be familiar with might be foreign to them, and they have other associations. But there's also a potential in the actual writing of the essay. I don't know whether you would agree with that. There is something in the actual writing of an essay, which, as you've already said, is also a form of thinking, which could be radical and different in an education system which is often not conducive to essayistic thinking.
So that in itself begs the question, do you think it's teachable?
Yeah.
I mean, reading essays can be teachable, but writing essays is something you can teach.
I'm convinced you can teach it. And the method I had, because I've been teaching for 40 years, and the last 22 years were in Academy of Fine Arts. So those students were not born to be intellectuals. They were born to be artists. But artists are the most implicit intellectuals. They're very, very intelligent, but in other ways. You can see it in their photos, in what they paint, in what they do on stage. You can see there's much intelligence at work. But how can you bring them so far to put it down in words? And then my method was mostly to, for a few weeks, have a discussion course on a certain topic that I knew would bring about some friction in different points of view, and hustle it well, and make them talk about it, and say at the end, write down what you think about it or what you did not agree with in the others, their point of view. Make small statements, because we all have still, I think you also know it, beginning to write is still intimidating. Even at my age, after more than 50 years of writing, the beginning is intimidating you. It's like opening a door of a building you do not know. And certainly for young people, it's intimidating to do. And very often I saw that they answered, but I don't have anything to say about this. Leave me alone. I said, why not? And then they said, because, and they started. I said, write this down. You have already started, but you don't know. But you're afraid of the writing. But you can say it orally, so you can put it down as well. And if you do it in small steps, even the last ones will follow. You know it well. You're in pedagogy as so you know that there are people who are very swift, who are following you from the beginning, and others that you really have to convince. And if you prepare them well in a sort of topic and gradually bring them to writing down small notes every time, at the end you can say after 5 weeks, now you're all going to produce a text of about 5 or 10 pages. You can do it now. And mostly that worked out. So if I wouldn't have been positive and optimist, I wouldn't have been so long in teaching.
Yeah. We've been talking about tradition of the essay, and let's say the history of the essay is heavily determined by a specific book and journal print culture. And the evident question is, we're in a different moment now, different publication strategies, different technologies, different possibilities. Did those change in your experience, in your personal experience even? Does that change the nature of the essay, the fact that you can publish digitally, maybe faster, but people require you to write shorter text? They want maybe to have you insert more titles in the middle, because those will determine the algorithm, and your text will crop up sooner when they are searched. Things like that. Does that change your writing?
My own I would like to, in this regard, I would like to maybe describe others' writings. I'm completely into online forms of essay writing at the moment, especially as they are produced around more closed platforms like Substack. I pay for a couple of writers who publish a newsletter that I get in my inbox every month or every 2 weeks, and I pay them like €5 a month. And these newsletters are only for subscribers. And I think this is a really interesting development. It also has its problematic sides, because the essay for the open audience, like the mass audience potentially, or the audience that you cannot really define yet, I think that's something of the past. I think more and more we consume writing and culture in these more small spheres of subscription-based models. The funny thing is that actually it does not favor shorter texts. These essays I get in my inbox, 10,000 words at least. But it does change, because usually this group of subscribers is a group of like-minded people from all over the world, but they have similar interests in a specific topic. And you can see that the style of essay writing is also directed towards this group. So you can know your audience better. I think it's a response to cancel culture as well, especially in 2018, 2019, 2020, cancel culture was much more intensive than now. And as a result, a lot of writers and artists put their work behind paywalls to feel less exposed, to feel less vulnerable. And it just produces a different kind of writing. And I think it's a new development that has not yet been so described and understood.
Ironically, it's very similar to Montaigne in his time, which was also very limited circulation of texts. And they weren't behind paywalls, but of course there was also limited access for everybody. Maybe I think it's more or less 9 o'clock. I want to come back to where we started, the essay and the novel. Who is the reader that you're writing your essays for? Are those the same readers as for your novels? I have a feeling that if we were here for a discussion about the novel and Stefan's and Persis's new novel, then the room would probably be more packed than it is now. So that in itself begs the question: who's the readership of your? Do you have a clear idea, a clear view of that?
Of the essay. Yeah,
of the essay. Is it for your friends? Friends you were talking about, the Substack people?
Are your essay books, your essay collections, do they sell significantly less than your novels?
Of course. A fraction only. They collected my essays, and they're much too expensive as well. So this is very limited. And then I meet people, I publish an essay, they come to me and say, I've bought your new book, but it's not like your last novel. It's a bit difficult, It's theoretical. I say, hey, there's essay on the cover. Ah, yeah, okay. So some people don't even realize that you are being warned that you're publishing a book which is more theoretical or not. So all of this culture of the novel, because the novel has done something incredible for our literary thinking. The novel has, I think that even the essay, as we know it now, is a product of the domination of the novel. Everything which is not a novel is what? You're writing sentences, you're writing prose. In the 18th century, the French prose, for instance, was everything. It was very vague. On faisait de la prose. And this prose could be letters, it could be Madame de Sévigné, etc. So a novel could be very many things. And a novel has become, by the Anglo-Saxon model of the well-written novel, which is an obsession in the Anglo-Saxon world, more than in the other cultural spheres, has, of course, formed a certain audience, sort of, do you say that electorate in English? Electorat? Electorate. A bunch of people who only want to read novels and associate novels with literature, while all the rest is also literature. Of course, in what we called then 20 years ago postmodern literature, you were again free to do what you wanted. Umberto Eco began by writing hybrid novels, novels with essayistic things in it. And then you saw, after the destruction of the novel in Paris, but the rest of the world didn't mind, and continued writing novels, of course, the novel has become what I think you could describe as an essay in the form of an allegory. A good novel to me is in fact an essay, an implicit essay. It's an essay in the form of a story. It's a parable. So the parable also is a very nice form of prose. So all the myths, etc. We have so very many forms of text which we are more free to roll into one text these days. So maybe we should now, we have been talking about the essay all this evening, and say, okay, the essay is just part of the whole thing, and not isolate it too much. Because the essay is also a Moloch. It eats the other literatures. It eats prose, it eats poetry. It resembles poetry, it resembles stories, etc. So the essay has changed a lot again now. And it's not, it has freed itself from the academic strain as well. Because, you know, what you have to respond to in academia is completely different from what we have to do. But we see that academia has some sort of synergy with the essay writers out there who do all sort of strange things. We can influence you guys, and you, academia, influence us, of course, with some sort of stringency of thinking and method.
What you say, you see also in the fact that more and more essays, at least that's my impression, have a narrative structure. You have sort of narrative essays where it's an essayistic reflection, but there's a story tied into it. And
Paul Auster.
Yeah. Do you want to add something, or do we wait?
You said very beautiful things. I agree. The essay is everywhere. It's not some little genre for bookish people. I think it's a voracious beast.
It's a voracious beast.
Yeah, and if it's everywhere, then it has to be beyond borders as well. Okay, time for some questions from the audience, if you like. Don't feel as if you have to, but feel free to think for a couple of minutes. Yves.
Thank you very much.
We have a microphone because we're recording this, and
Thank you very much. It was very interesting to listen to your thoughts. I've got a very small question on the book of essay. Now you talked about the essay as a genre, many genres. But essays are part of a collection. Like Stefan wrote books of essays, Sneeuwdoosjes, Fuga's en Pimpelmees, and so on. How do you compose that kind of books, volumes consisting of essays? Because the essays, they speak to each other in the book. Can you elaborate on that?
At that time, I always said I make anthologies of my essays. I pick out essays and put them together, like a good musician makes a record. You have a few Looney Tunes, you have a blues, you have this, you have that. What do I miss out? And I really composed them. And I thought that sort of essay doesn't fit in. For instance, I've written an essay which is completely forgotten about Joti Toft. It's not in my collected essays as well. It didn't fit anywhere. Because making a book of essays is also composing. That's very correct what you say. So it was very much fun to do that, and it's also a creative act. Because imagine certain essays in the volumes you mentioned. Sneeuwdoosjes, for instance, is a letter about Walter Benjamin. If I would put the essays on Benjamin at the back and begin with another essay, you get another book. So there it responds to the creativity of writing a novel. How do you manage to make it this bow of tension? Where do you pick it up and where do you put it down? Certainly, I paid a lot of attention to that. Yeah.
Thanks, good question. Other questions? Karel?
Thank you. This is a question as a very unexperienced writer who hasn't written a lot yet. So we've talked about how in the beginning you don't know what you're going to write. You don't always know where you finish. And the essay is neither fiction nor non-fiction, or it's not fantasy. It has to be thought-provoking and subjective and individual, but it also has to be based on something true and objective. How do you as a writer trust yourself and know or feel that what you are writing will reach the audience in the way that you intended, or that it is something valuable? Do you feel it, or do you have some criteria to?
I propose, Persis, you take this question because it's so difficult.
It's a very difficult question, and there's a lot of intuition behind it, which is, of course, impossible to explain. I think there should be a feeling that it exceeds the personal, of course. It starts always with a personal fascination or obsession or even experience. I rarely write about my own life, but you need to feel convinced that this is going to be important for others too. And for me, there's always, I need to feel that it exceeds also the didactic, that it's not me explaining the reader something, but actually wanting to know something and having an intuition that there's so much more to gather about something, and it will be a quest, a journey. If it's just, this is my opinion and I want to tell, I want someone else to convince, that's another genre.
Are there aesthetic elements involved in those? I mean, it's not just about thoughts and about didacticism. It has an specific artistic.
Very important for me, again, is voice. Often it starts there with stumbling upon a voice, which is rhythm, melody, even persona, maybe, something that sticks. But yeah, this is not very helpful.
In fact, you ask for the question of self-criticism. How do you do that? How do you know that you're writing something that is worth communicating it to others? That's a very painful question because you don't know. You're very vulnerable. So what you can do is read it out to someone. Mm. I remember that at a certain moment I was quite young and I had written some fragments on the films of Marguerite Duras, which fascinated me at the time. So, and I went to a restaurant with my girlfriend. She said, "What have you been doing today?" I said, "I'm writing on Marguerite Duras." She said, "Oh, fantastic. What did you write?" I said, I'm writing on the fact that nothing happens in her films." She said, "Oh, interesting. What shall we eat?" But when she read the text, she said, "Oh, but it's fascinating." But I couldn't say what it was about, because the point in an essay is not always the point. The point is how you write about it. Did you write good prose? Did you seduce the reader to go on with you? And something that can help you as a young writer is read it to somebody you trust, really. A lover or a friend or a brother or a sister or anything that you say, that this is somebody who respects me and I can trust this person and I want to read it. And you sweat like in an exam, of course, because you don't know. It's personal, as you said.
And also read it
you
out aloud.
You throw yourself in it.
Also read it out aloud so that the sound is right, or is
for some people it helps.
Yeah.
To me, it doesn't help. Just at the end, okay. I have to reread in silence to know it because I have to taste the prose in my head. Mm-hmm. But for some people, it's a good school to try to read fragments, not the whole thing, but a fragment, and you will learn out of your reading. You will hear yourself say things. And you will change them. And that's how you learn it, step by step, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's very good advice to share, to make others read it. Writing is not a solitary profession in that sense. And I think my best essays were the ones that I didn't intend to write. That's also bad advice, but I think of a beautiful essay. For example, there's a little book by Nathalie Léger called Notes on the Life of Barbara Loden, which is also on a film. And that happened because she was writing an encyclopedic entry on I think, on Barbara Loden, and then it became this whole beautiful essay because she kept being obsessed by Wanda, this character in a film. It's often just, what happens when you're planning other things.
I think the most beautiful thing has been said by Persis now. My most beautiful essays I didn't intend to write. Now we have said something about the real magic of essay. That's perfect.
And the best questions are those that you didn't want to ask. So time to think about. Any other questions? Final remarks by somebody from the TES?
Yeah, I was still thinking about the questions that were asked about your personal developments as essayists. And then Jürgen also remarked that maybe the times are also changing. And that led me to think of the question whether there are indeed times that are more or less suitable for the essay. Obviously, if we're thinking about Montaigne, his essays also emerged in a time of religious conflict, political conflict, which made his kind of more self-critical, hesitant style almost like a political statement, right? And I was wondering if you are thinking about these contemporary times, whether these are times that are either beneficial or rather detrimental for the essay.
That's a question about Kulturgeschichte. Are there certain periods in history where it's less evident that you can write essays? Is that what you mean with the question?
Yes.
Yeah. As far as I can see, essays have always been written in all sort of periods.
And you can definitely see how certain essay styles were a response to time. I mean, I brought Walter Benjamin. We've mentioned him a lot tonight. I mean, his best texts, one of his best and well-known texts was written just before his flight to Spain, like in the midst of destruction of a European culture. And maybe you could say that formally there are some resonance with that or an answer to that. I think today you could say that writing an essay is definitely not. I mean, the times are definitely not very fecund for essay writing, but to still keep on writing essays is maybe an act of resistance. I mean, I don't want to blow up the profession of the essayist and tap our shoulders, but it does go against the grain of today.
If I may, I mean, if you look at the history of the essay, there's a history of deaths of the essay, right? So Hazlitt tells us Montaigne has already done whatever there has been done, so there's no need to write anymore. And then Virginia Woolf again. In modern, there is no need to write any more essays, and then Michael Hamburg and the death of individualism, there's no need to do that, and the history of the golden ages of the essay. So actually this is a term which we've been using. Some scholars have written about this being the golden age. So, but I think that kind of narrative of death and the celebration of the golden sort of misses the fact that the essay does not always remain the same thing. We've been talking about the essay as if it were one thing, and yet we've spoken about its plurality. So I guess rather than certain times being conducive to the essay or not, I would say certain times being conducive to a certain kind of essay. So if you look at Addison and Steele with the birth of periodicals, that kind of didactic essay perhaps has its time and place at that moment. And perhaps the question then would be, what kind of essay does our time call for, rather than whether it actually calls for the essay or not? Because if you look back historically, since Montaigne, despite all the pronouncements of the death of the essay, it has remained consistently there. Of course, people will sometimes deny this because they believe that the essay has to be a certain kind of essay. So let's say if you have a predisposition towards the personal, then you will not like the Victorian 19th century Macaulay kind of essay. But it has consistently been there. So then perhaps a question which to echo Thijs would be, what kind of essay does today call for?
Or does not call for.
Or does not
I
call
would
for.
say if you write essays that everyone loves and everyone buys, then you're really not a good essayist.
Okay.
In the sense that I do value the essay also as the essayist as a contrarian voice, or as someone going against the grain and not with.
So you don't write it for everybody.
I mean, if you please everybody, then and you then you're just defending the world as is.
Any other questions? Persis just reminded me that I still have a question to ask. We also did it this afternoon with a group of specialists, and there were two questions at the same time. First question is, who for you is the best essayist, most representative of the essay? So who is your favorite essayist, and maybe also why? And secondly, because as we said, reading essays is encouraging for people to start reading other texts, and the people who are going home want to have something to read tomorrow. The second question is, which essay by that author is, according to you, the best essay? Well, we did this afternoon. The first person to speak began to spawn a series of 12, 15 names, so one name only, please. We'll start with Mario. We do it in alphabetical order, like we start.
Yeah, I mean, so we did it this morning. So one name. So I'll go for Seneca on noise for a number of reasons. First of all, because it shows that the essayistic can exist before there is a text that calls itself an essay. Because it introduces the idea of a swerve or turn. It's an essay in which Seneca tries to come to terms with noise. And of course, being a Stoic thinker, he thinks of noise as something that is external and that can only disturb you if you do not have internal peace. And there's this didactic tone, but there's a particular turn. I'm going to spoil it. You can read the other essays by Seneca. There's a certain moment where there's a turn, because all this grunting of people lifting weights becomes annoying. And at one point he tells us, yeah, but I wanted to give myself a test, and I can't bear this any longer, and I'm going to have to move. So there is this essayistic swerve. There is this conversational element. There is this philosophy, which is also ironic, and which begins in a certain way but ends in something completely different. So I would recommend Seneca's Letters as a good introduction to an essayistic thinking before, to be fair, Montaigne said, he took a lot of what he wrote from Seneca. So that's my recommendation.
Great. Persis.
Well, I've had sleepless nights all week because of this question.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Especially because the essay can mean so many different things, as you pointed out. So I'm not going to say Calvino. I'm not going to say Agamben. And these have all been through my mind. In the end, I decided Walter Benjamin. And then if I have to choose one, it would be the in English, it's called Thesis on the Philosophy of History. Yeah, and that's not because I think it's his best, but I think it's representative of what I mean when I elect Benjamin as the quintessential essayist. The list, the fragment, the exploration of something that is so much a call to be answered by others. I mean, there have been written countless books to interpret this essay. So in that sense, it is very much a conversation. Also for its importance in avant-garde culture today. If I think of these online spheres that I've been looking at a lot for my new book, this essay is quintessential and has spawned a whole movement. So yes, Benjamin.
I have very bad luck that my name begins with an H and hers with B, because I have also Walter Benjamin's Thesen zur Begriff der Geschichte. I swear. Not a second of doubt.
Oh, then it's objectively universally true, no?
It is. And coming back to the question of Thijs, has the essay always been possible? This man has written this probably on his flight.
Yeah, yeah.
He had been in Le Mille, in the concentration camp. He was going on foot to Portbou. Now it's very well documented, well, sort of books about it. It's very fashionable these days. But if you read the Thesen zur Begriff der Geschichte, and you see those allegories, that always when we are thinking that there is a sort of hidden chess player machine in our arguments who is drawing the who's putting the strings, and that theology, metaphysics is in all what we're thinking about. You can never forget this. This is so poetic. This is so unforgettable. Written by somebody who would die as a victim of fascism, as one of the greatest Jewish spirits, which he was. And then this unforgettable last image, this angel of our fate and of history, who is blown backwards to the future, watching the burning ruins of our history. And that is how we move to the future. There is nothing better in essay writing that has ever been written, and nothing more impressive as this. So, yeah,
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. As Seneca would say, make some noise.
Dank je wel. Ja, dat vind ik heel mooi. Ja,
Dank je wel.
dit hebben we niet